They said the hum of machines couldn't carry secrets, but I've learned otherwise. The soft whine of a laser sight warming up tells its own story, one of patience, precision, and preparation. And sometimes the smallest red dot dancing across a wall can hold more weight than 100 shouted commands. And if you believe that true strength often hides in silence, that authority can rest in the hands of those overlooked until the right moment arrives. Then take a second to like and subscribe. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't the tale of a loud commander barking orders, but of a woman who was content to stay in the shadows until the shadows themselves gave her no choice. Her name was Claire Voss, and at 28, she looked more like an overworked engineer than the quiet storm she truly was. Standing in the armory's sterile light with her hands steady on the polymer grip of a sidearm, as though she were tuning an instrument instead of preparing a weapon, and I remember that morning because it didn't feel like training, it felt like waiting for a curtain to rise. The room smelled faintly of oil and steel, a perfume that clung to the back of the throat, and cadets moved in and out with their usual mix of arrogance and exhaustion, yawning as they checked their gear, sneering at Claire when they thought she couldn't hear, dismissing her as the tech girl. Because to them, anyone who wasn't in the field drills was irrelevant, a background character in their self-declared hero's journey. But I knew better, because there was something in the way she worked. Every adjustment she made to the pistol's sighting rail, every meticulous note she scratched into her ledger with neat, unbroken handwriting, spoke of someone who had lived in places where errors cost more than embarrassment. They cost blood. She wasn't tall, she wasn't imposing, and her uniform lacked the ornamentation the younger officers chased like children hunting badges. But she carried an aura, one I couldn't quite name then, like a sealed letter waiting to be opened by the right pair of hands. And the more they overlooked her, the more I realized she was the one person in that armory who saw everything. She tracked more than weapons. Her eyes flicked briefly to the condensation forming on the armory window, to the faint draft sneaking under the steel door, to the way one cadet's sidearm had a loose magazine catch that could betray him in the middle of a firefight. She saw it all, filed it away, said nothing. Silence was her shield. And I thought to myself, isn't it strange how the ones most prepared for war are the least eager to announce it? That morning, a cocky second lieutenant named Hardin strolled past her workbench, chewing gum with the smugness of a man who thought himself bulletproof, and he leaned on the counter just enough to intrude into her focus, grinning as he drawled. You gonna polish those toys all day, Voss, or actually fire one? His friends laughed, sharp bursts of cruelty echoing off the cinder block walls, and Claire didn't even lift her head. She simply adjusted the windage dial one more click, red, sliding into perfect alignment, then logged the correction into her book as though his voice were nothing more than static on the radio. That dismissal enraged him more than any insult could have, and he leaned closer, lowering his voice so only I, standing nearby, could hear. Don't forget, we do the fighting. You just babysit the hardware. I saw her pause then, her pen hovering over the page for half a heartbeat, before she finished the note and looked up at him with eyes that didn't spark with anger, but with something colder, older, something that told me she had already measured this man and found him lacking. She said nothing, and in that silence Hardin faltered, retreating with a smirk that was more self-defense than triumph, and I realized that for Claire Voss, words were unnecessary. She let time reveal the truth. Around us, the cadets kept moving, checking rifles, bragging about drills, but Claire remained anchored in her quiet ritual, sight after sight, pistol after pistol, the red beams flickering against the far wall like tiny signals, like a language only she could read, and though I didn't yet know it, those signals were warnings. The base was humming with a routine that day, but in her stillness she was bracing for the shift she knew was coming. Because here's the truth about Claire. She hadn't chosen this assignment to vanish into obscurity. She had been placed here, deliberately, a chess piece waiting to be moved when the board flipped, and while everyone else saw a technician with too much patience for detail, those who knew her real name, the one whispered only in certain corridors, would have recognized the call sign Crimson Pike. And if you've never heard it, that's because you weren't meant to. Crimson Pike wasn't written into training manuals. It wasn't briefed in classrooms. It was spoken only when silence had stretched too long and action could no longer wait. That day hadn't arrived yet, but I could see it in the way her hand hovered just a fraction longer over the final pistol, in the way her shoulders straightened at a sound beyond the door. The measured rhythm of boots heavier than cadet drills, boots that belonged to someone who hadn't come to mock her, but to summon her. Claire looked up just as the door swung open, and though she returned her gaze to the pistol on her bench, I noticed the faintest flicker of recognition in her eyes, a sign that the curtain was about to rise on something none of us had been prepared for, except her. The sound of those boots grew heavier, deliberate, a cadence too precise to belong to any cadet, and when Major Ellison stepped through the armory door, the entire atmosphere shifted as though the air itself straightened its spine, his presence carrying the weight of years in the field and the kind of authority that silenced a room without needing to raise a voice. And while the others scrambled to their feet in a mixture of formality and nervous pride, Claire remained seated, her pen mid-stroke on the page, finishing a note about calibration drift as though time itself had not just paused for the arrival of a senior officer. It was then that I noticed something curious, because instead of walking directly to the racks or addressing the group, Ellison's eyes scanned the room once, passed over every single cadet, and locked firmly on her. And in that frozen second of recognition, I felt as though the floor beneath us shifted, because he wasn't looking at her like a tech or an assistant, but as though she were a superior waiting to be acknowledged. "Lieutenant Voss," he said, voice sharp enough to slice through the stale armory air. But instead of a reprimand or order, he did something no one expected. He came to full attention and saluted her first. The room fell silent in an instant. Every cadet, every officer frozen in disbelief as Claire, 28 and underestimated, returned the salute without hesitation, her movement crisp and flawless, not with the awkwardness of someone imitating formality, but with the confidence of someone who had given and received salutes at higher stakes than any of them could imagine. "Crimson Pike," Ellison continued, his tone formal now, loud enough to echo against the cinder block walls. "Orders ready." You could almost hear the collective intake of breath as the words sank in, the phrase unfamiliar, yet ringing with the unmistakable cadence of a call sign. And in that moment the armory ceased to be a room full of cadets mocking a quiet technician. It became the stage for a revelation none of us were prepared to witness. Hardin, the loudmouthed lieutenant from earlier, shifted uneasily, his face blanching as he realized he had mocked someone who outranked him in ways he couldn't even comprehend. And the other cadets exchanged quick, nervous glances, their arrogance draining away like water through a sieve. Claire stood slowly, setting down her pen, closing the ledger with deliberate care, and when she finally spoke, her voice was measured, calm, but heavy with authority. "Status of breach protocol?" Ellison handed her a thin folder, its edges worn from handling, and though I couldn't see the contents, the way her eyes scanned it with practiced speed told me this wasn't new to her. This was a language she had spoken before, one she had sworn not to use again until necessity forced her hand. Around us, cadets whispered, "Crimson Pike. What does that even mean?" But no one dared raise the question out loud, not with the major standing there like a sentinel confirming every hidden truth. Claire began issuing orders, not suggestions, not timid proposals, but sharp, precise commands that sliced through confusion like blades. Check blind spots in sectors 2 and 4. Reset the secondary calibration on the perimeter sensors. Pull the last 12 hours of camera feeds and flag any anomaly with more than 2 frames of displacement. The cadets moved instantly, almost without realizing it, their training overridden by something primal, the instinct to follow someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And as I watched her, I realized the true shift wasn't in the discovery of her call sign, but in the way her presence rewrote the hierarchy of the room. Suddenly, she wasn't the quiet technician, she was the anchor, the one everyone unconsciously aligned themselves to. And for the first time, even Hardin followed without question. Ellison, still standing at attention near the doorway, didn't interrupt, didn't add, didn't override. He was there, only to confirm what her presence already commanded. She was Crimson Pike, and Crimson Pike was in charge. It was then I began to piece together fragments of rumor I'd once overheard in corridors and mess halls, whispered stories of an operation deep in Eastern Europe years ago, where a young operative with a mind like a chess master had rerouted an ambush by predicting the enemy's movements before they made them, saving an entire unit with nothing more than a map, a pen, and unshakable nerve. The name had never been shared, the details buried in classified silence. But now, watching Claire stand in the armory issuing orders with quiet precision, I knew who that story had been about. The tension in the room thickened as a klaxon sounded in the distance, shrill and insistent, the automated system announcing what she had already been preparing for: perimeter breach. Sector 2. Possible infiltration. And while the cadets froze for a fraction of a second, startled, Claire's expression didn't change. She snapped the folder shut, handed it back to Ellison, and spoke with calm authority that cut through the alarm like steel. "We move now." The transformation was immediate. The mocking silence of the morning dissolved into disciplined motion, the cadets moving like pieces on a board she alone could see fully, every step, every order, threading into a plan they didn't even realize they were following until it was already happening. And as we stepped out of the armory into the fading light of evening, the red glow of the alarms bouncing off the wet asphalt, I realized something chilling. This wasn't the moment Claire Voss had been discovered. This was the moment she had allowed herself to be revealed. And if she was Crimson Pike, then what we were walking into wasn't training anymore. It was war. The klaxon still howled in the background, but to Claire it might as well have been silence, because the way she moved, unhurried yet precise, made it clear she had already built the scenario in her mind long before the siren confirmed it. And as we crossed the damp concrete toward the perimeter gate, the cadets' boots striking in uneven rhythm behind her, I noticed how the chaos of flashing red lights seemed to bend around her calm, as though panic had no place in her orbit. She paused at the access point, one hand brushing against the pistol at her hip, and then with the simplest of gestures, a finger raised, a curt tilt of her chin, she directed the group into formation tighter than any of them had ever managed during drills. And though they didn't understand why, they obeyed, drawn by that gravity of certainty that only true leaders carry. Through the chain-link fence, the tree line swayed under a restless wind, shadows shifting just enough to make you doubt your own eyes, and somewhere out there, past the range of sight, lay the threat she had already anticipated, the breach that others would have dismissed as probably just weather, the same way Hardin had dismissed her hours before, and now those same voices were silent, waiting on her word. "Sector 2 blind spot, west drainage culvert," she said, her tone low but firm, as though she were reciting coordinates from memory rather than reading from any live feed. And when a cadet whispered, "But the cameras," she cut him off with a glance that carried more weight than a shout, reminding us all that cameras fail, but instincts trained in shadows do not. She led us toward the culvert, her boots steady in the mud, her pistol raised but not trembling, the faint red laser sight flickering across the brush like a warning before vanishing again. And then we saw them. Footprints, fresh and deep, not belonging to any cadet, not military issue, just as she had predicted, and the weight of it sank in. This was real, not training, not a drill. And had she not been here, had Crimson Pike remained just a whisper, we would have been blind. Ellison moved up beside her, tension tightening his jaw. But even he didn't speak. He let her work, because he knew, better than anyone, that this was her arena. She crouched, touched the wet ground with gloved fingers, and then she said, almost to herself but loud enough for us to hear, "Two men, not running. Coordinated movement, staggered steps, trying to mask weight distribution." She looked up at the dark tree line. "They've breached before. This isn't their first time." Her words froze the blood in more than one cadet, because suddenly it wasn't a game. It wasn't about points on a scoreboard. It was about the fact that someone out there had been studying us, exploiting weaknesses we hadn't even noticed until she walked into this story. "Positions," she ordered, and the group scattered exactly where she wanted them, not out of fear, but because she made it impossible to imagine doing anything else. Minutes dragged heavy as hours, the wind rattling the fence, our breaths loud in the hush, and then, almost too smoothly, two shadows emerged from the culvert's edge, figures cloaked in dark gear, moving like ghosts who had expected the night to hide them. But the night no longer belonged to them. It belonged to Claire Voss. "Lights," she commanded, and the floodlamps flared, catching the intruders mid-step, their movements betraying hesitation for the first time. Weapons raised. They froze as Claire's voice rang sharp. "Drop them." There was no negotiation in her tone, no plea, just absolute authority. And for a moment, even the intruders seemed to understand they weren't facing a squad of cadets, but Crimson Pike herself. They hesitated, and in that hesitation the cadets found their courage. Tightening formation, weapons leveled, eyes locked not on the shadows but on her, drawing strength from the way she didn't flinch. Ellison barked the formal arrest order, but it was Claire's presence that froze the moment, her calm as steady as the red of her laser sight settling just above the intruder's chest. When they finally dropped their weapons, the relief that rippled through the cadets wasn't celebration. It was respect, deep and unspoken, the kind born of realizing you had just been saved by someone you didn't even know you needed. Back at the compound, reports were filed, protocols dissected, and Hardin, pale and silent, sat in the corner, avoiding her gaze as though the weight of his earlier arrogance might crush him now. But Claire, true to form, didn't gloat, didn't correct, didn't even acknowledge his shame. She simply returned to the armory, reopened her ledger, and began writing as though nothing had happened, her silence heavier than any lecture could have been. The next morning, whispers spread faster than alarms. Crimson Pike had returned. Cadets who once laughed at her now paused mid-stride to salute, some awkwardly, some with reverence. And though she accepted each gesture with the same quiet nod, she never sought their admiration. It wasn't her way. Later, in the mess hall, one cadet, braver than the rest, asked softly, "Why didn't you tell us who you were?" She looked up from her tray, eyes steady, and answered with a single sentence that cut through every rumor, every question. "Respect isn't claimed, it's earned, daily." And in that moment, I realized that the true revelation wasn't her call sign, or the fact that she had once outsmarted enemies on foreign soil, but that she had reminded us all of something too often forgotten. Leadership isn't loud, it isn't boastful, it doesn't demand attention. It waits, it watches, and when the time comes, it speaks once, clearly, and the world listens.